name is Jim. We're going to be talking about the SawStop PCS today on
Kilimanjaro.
What I've got here is the SawStop Professional Cabinet Saw, or PCS. So this one comes with the 3 horsepower motor. There's also an option for a 1 3/4 horsepower motor. I've never run into any issues with the 3/4 horsepower not being enough power. On my other saw, my old saw back here that I still use, it only has a 1 horsepower motor on it, and I've really never run into issues, even with dados blades on there. Never had any issues with even a 1 horsepower, so a 1 3/4 is probably going to be sufficient for most of the time anyway. It's not that much more for the 3 horsepower motor, so it's something I did get. This one also has the 36-inch fence. There's a 30-inch fence, which is not as nice of a fence. This is a really nice fence. I'll go into that in a little more details. They also make a 54-inch fence, but as you can see, I'm already constrained on my 36-inch fence by dust collector here, so I can only cut about 30 inches before I start hitting that, or unless I slide the saw out. On the other side of the blade, you do get another 12 inches of capacity if you want to cut on this side of the blade for some reason. So the PCS sits kind of in the middle of the range of the SawStop saws. Below it, there's the contractor saws and the portable saws, and then above it, there's the industrial cabinet saw. So the industrial saw, the big differences are you can get up to a 7.5 horsepower motor, which seems kind of excessive to me, and it's got a slightly bigger top. The bigger top is nice because you get more work surface and everything, but it does have the detriment that then the saw blade is farther back on the saw, so when you're trying to push through and get the piece of wood after it's been cut, you really have to walk around the saw to get it as opposed to trying to reach over. So it's not all good things with the industrial cabinet saw, and it's another $1,000 or so to get that saw. I assume by now everybody knows the deal with saw stops. If the blade's running and you put your finger into it, it's going to stop the saw blade before you have a chance to get hurt. You might get a little nick or something, but you're not going to lose a finger. You're not going to have to go to the ER. So the way that works is underneath the table here, there's one of these cartridges. It has an explosive charge up in the top here. If it detects that there's something conductive, like your finger touching the blade, it'll fire that explosive charge, kicking this block of aluminum into the blade and stopping it instantly. So that's great. You're not going to get hurt. It does mean it wrecks both this cartridge and the blade, so you're going to be out a couple $100, but that's a lot better than an ER visit or losing a finger or something like that. Like I said, it does work by conductivity, so it will be triggered by other wet things like wet pieces of wood or other things that conduct electricity like metal. So if you've got a really green piece of wood, or you've got a piece of wood that has some staples in it or have nails in it, or you're worried it might, you can disable that safety feature. Obviously then it's not going to go off, so you've got to be a little more careful, but it does mean that you can cut those woods without having to worry about this firing off and being out your blade and your cartridge here. So that's a really nice feature. That's the only way I've ever heard of anybody getting hurt on this saw, though, is by turning that off and then putting their hand into the blade. So you have to worry a little bit that you may be a little bit less cautious with the saw because you think that you have this added level of protection. I'm sure there's a failure rate on these as well as being disabled, that this, particularly if it gets old or something, may not fire. I've never heard of it happening, but I'm sure it's possible. So you got to be careful with that you don't become complacent around the saw, even though, you're probably not going to get hurt by putting your fingers into the blade. The other thing about this, the other way you can get hurt on a table saw is with kickback. So let's talk about this guard here and how this guard helps prevent the kickback. The guard on this saw is extremely well designed. Somebody clearly put a lot of effort into figuring out the best way to make a guard for a table saw. That way you don't take it off. That's always the problem with any safety guard, that it's in the way, it's bothersome, you can't see what you're doing, so people take them off and then they don't do any good. So before we get into that, let me say that I do have the saw unplugged because I'm going to be touching the blade here. And I've also removed the little safety tab. If you're curious about the plug, it's got these 2 straight blades here. That's for the 3 horsepower saw. It's a 220 volt plug. I think it's a 6-15 style plug. So if you're curious about that. So back to the guard here. So the first line of defense against you putting your hand on the blade here is this clear plastic shroud. It's nice, you can still see what you're doing, but even as the blade raises and lowers, it's still going to cover the guard, prevent you from sliding your hand into it this way, or from the top, or any other way. Very nice. It does easily flip out of the way, so if you're right up against the fence, so that it might be hitting the fence, you can easily flip it out of the way. And then you have this secondary guard here, so this will not prevent you from, any sort of ways you can get your hand in there. But if you happen to fall, if you trip, or if you just, aren't paying attention and go to put your hand down on top of it, or even from the side or something, it's most likely going to prevent you from hitting the blade as well. And that clears the fence, and so it shouldn't ever be an issue. Now that's the primary way people get hurt on saws, or on table saws, is by putting their hand in the blade. The other way, however, is if the saw kicks back. So what can happen is, as you're making a cut, if the piece of wood has some gnarly grain in it or it's got some wetness to it or something, after you cut the board may want to curl back around and close up on that cut. If it does that, it can close up on the back part of the blade here. That black part of the blade is obviously going forward at a very high rate of speed, so it catches there and gets thrown forward. That's why you should always be standing off to the side while you're making a cut, but it can get thrown forward with some really incredible force at really great rates of speed. In my high school shop, there was a door behind the table saw, and there was a hole through that door where a 2x4 had gotten caught on it and shot back and put a hole right through the door. Fortunately, nobody got hurt when that happened. So to prevent that, there's a couple of things on this saw. The first is this riving knife. That's this black piece of metal here, and that is perfectly in line with the saw, and it will prevent, if a board starts to close up, it will prevent it from closing all the way. The other two things that are on here are these little tabs on the side here, and they've got some teeth on them. So as the board is sliding through, once it hits these, it can go past them no problem as these rotate out of the way. There's one on the other side. But if it starts to try to go forward, if it was getting caught, they would dig down and those teeth would grip into the board. So the nice thing about this guard is that a lot of this stuff you can take off if you don't want it. So for instance, this metal piece you can take off, and these little riving knife pieces, there's a nice little catch up here where you can store them if you find that they're getting in the way or not. So you can still use the guard, but at a reduced level of protection if you find that one of those things are getting in the way. I generally take this metal part off, and I will frequently have these hooks held up here, mostly because when you go to put the guard on, these, if they're down, they'll get stuck underneath it. So let me show you how the guard goes on and off now. One last feature on the guard that I forgot to mention is that it also really helps with dust collection. Back here, there's a port for a vacuum, or that you can run down to your dust collector. There's actually a kit that makes a tube that so it can go that way and loop around and then back down to the main dust collection port. Sometimes you can get that for free. They frequently have a promotion in the spring that lets you get that or the mobile base for free. I haven't hooked mine up yet. I just need to run a hose right to my dust collector, which is right over here, but I just haven't gotten a chance to do that. So the way that works is this tube runs through the top of the guard here, runs around, and then curls down here and picks up all the sawdust that gets generated from the saw. The rest of it goes down into the cabinet, and there's a dust collector port on the back that you can hook up to prevent any dust from getting out of there. So to change change the blade, take the guard off, what you do, you flip it up, then you got to take the throat plate out. The throat plate comes out really easily. You just flip that little handle up. There's a little tab right here. Flip that up, and then it gets caught in the back a little bit, but you just slide it forward. So that comes out really easily. Then you just reach down. There's this nice big handle down there. You just reach down, pull that handle up, and then the guard will pop right out. So it's super easy to do, which makes it a lot more likely that you're going to put the guard back on if you've taken it off. The reason you might want to take it off is if you're making a cut that doesn't go all the way through the board, this knife is going to get in the way on the back, so you might want to take it off for that sort of cut. The one thing that does bug me is these saws here, these anti-kickback kind of tangs right here. They do lock and stow up here like that, so that's the way to prevent this, but normally if you've got them down and you go to put this in, you clamp it down. Now this hits back here, so you've got to remember to put that on or up beforehand, or you've got to raise the blade up to be able to get that out of the way. While we're over here, I'll show you how to change the blade. They give you these two really nice wrenches, make it really easy to get in there. One has a kind of triangular shape on it here, so that goes on the one side, and then this goes on the other side, and then you can just loosen that nut there to change your blade. When you do change your blade, down here, you have to make sure that the gap between the blade and the cartridge is set to the right level. You don't want the blade hitting the cartridge, and you don't want it too far away so it won't work. It's a very easy adjustment over on this side, and there's a tool that they give you that has a nice magnet on it so you can keep it on the side of the table saw so you don't lose it. Very easy to do, only takes a second or two, and you should only have to do it if you're changing, to a blade that's a significantly different diameter, which is pretty unusual. In the front of the saw, we have the various controls for it. Over here, we have the on-off switch. This is the only thing on the saw that I don't think is particularly well done and I don't particularly like. Normal use, flipping it on, flipping it off, that actually works great, no problems there. The problem is if you want to turn off the safety feature, it's not very clear on how to do that, and there's no label on here or anything that says how to do that. On the side here, there is a label that says what these two flashing lights here, there's a red and a green one, what those two flashing lights mean, how they're flashing, so that explains that, so that's very nice. But if you want to disable the saw, it's not real clear how to do that. So to turn the saw on, I've got it plugged in now. So first you turn it on, and then you've got to wait for it to initialize. So you've got to wait for this red light to start blinking. Once that red light stops blinking, then you can just flip it on and off. There's also a key over here. That key is what you use to disable the safety feature. If you turn the key and then flip the switch, then it will disable the safety feature if you want to be cutting some wet wood or some wood with some metal in it. So it's pretty straightforward to use, but it's a little hard to remember exactly how it does that. I wish they had put a little note on, sticker on here or something. I usually have to go look it up to remember exactly how to do it. You can also take that key away so that nobody can disable the feature if you're in a school or someplace where you don't want people to be able to do that. The other controls on the front here are the height adjustment that raises and lowers the blade. That works super well. Same thing with the tilt control here. They're very easy to use, really turn really nice and smoothly. And there's a lock on them if you want to keep it, make sure you're not going to accidentally bump them to change your angle or change your height of your blade. Last thing I want to talk about before we start actually making some cuts here is the fence. So this is the 36-inch T-Glide fence that they sell. It's a little bit of a nicer fence than the 30-inch one. I find that it works really well, and I would definitely recommend upgrading to that fence. So the way this fence works, it all happens at the front here. There's this big steel tube that runs the length of the saw, and that's what the fence clamps on. When you pull down on this lever right here, it squeezes some plastic bushings onto that and clamps it down really nice and tightly and doesn't move around on you. There's nothing at the back. There's no, some saws have a little catch on the back that will catch, and that's how it clamps down. This all happens at the front of the saw. The handle that you use is really nice. It's got a nice rubberized coat grip on it. It's nice and smooth and works really well. They've even thought that this through well enough to put some magnets on the top here. If you didn't have those magnets, which kind of hold it up in place, it might be dragging, and then when you try to slide it around, it might be a little more difficult to slide. So they have some nice magnets in there, really keep it out of the way and make it easy to slide. It's all adjustable, so you can adjust it to make sure that it's perfectly parallel with the blade. I made a video on that a while back, if you're interested in seeing that. It's got two little indicator lines here, one if you're on the right side of the fence, one if you're on the left side of the fence. And they've got a nice little line on them, which is adjustable, and they've got a little bit of a clear magnifying glass to make it a little easier to see. So this saw, it's for the US market. It has both inches and centimeters on it, or millimeters on it. So if you want to use either one, they're both there for you. It's time to actually make some cuts here. So for a blade, I've got a 30-tooth Blue Line Rip Freud blade. That's a pretty nice blade. It's got about an 1/8 inch kerf, so it's on the wider side. Makes really nice cuts. So I'm just going to take a sliver off the edge of here. This is a nice piece of ash. It's 1 3/4 thick, so this isn't going to tax the saw at all, but it's a pretty decent cut for it. So let's get going here. So I will be using, this is the push stick it actually came with. I still have that, and I'll just be using my other old stick here to keep my hands out of things. So I'm going to turn my dust collection on, then we'll make the cut. So first I'm going to turn the saw on just so you can hear it. And then the dust collection. As you can see, the saw didn't struggle at all with that cut. It leaves a really nice finish. Now, one thing I will say about the saw is you do need to adjust it. When I got my saw, the top of it was not perfectly in line with the blade, so I did need to spend a little while trying to get that adjusted and dialed in just perfectly. That's one thing that's true about the SawStop in general. Everything is adjustable on it. That's both good and bad. It's good because it means that you can get everything perfectly adjusted, but it's bad because it does mean that it takes some fiddling to get it all perfectly aligned so that your blade is perfectly vertical, your throat plate here is perfectly at the same height as the table, that your fence is perfectly parallel to the blade, and that your blade is perfectly parallel to the table, specifically to the miter slots in the table. So that's great that you can actually do that, but if you move the saw or when you first install it, you do need to go through all those adjustments. And I did make another video on that. If you want to see it, I'll leave a link down below for it. Let's do a crosscut here. So I didn't switch blades, so this is still a rip blade, so it's not exactly ideal here. And I did take the guard off so you can actually see what's going on here. This is the miter gauge that comes with the saw. It's not the best thing in the world. It's probably one of the few things that comes with the saw that I would say isn't, of a very high quality. But most people aren't going to use the miter gauge that comes with the saw anyway. They're going to switch to either a sled or one of the nicer miter gauges that are out there. So let's make this crosscut here. Even with found having the right blade in here. It still made a really nice cut. Obviously you could see here it didn't struggle at all with the cut. This is a nice old piece of Douglas fir. This is actually a door that I had. So it's about, 1.5 inches thick. You can use a dado stack with the saw. Mine's actually installed in my other table saw back here where I usually keep it, but you can install them in the SawStop. It works just fine with those. Doesn't have any problems. It has a long enough arbor to fit at least a 3/4 inch stack on it. You do need to buy a different cartridge that has a little more mass and a little wider block here. And you obviously need a different throat plate for that, but not a big deal to get those. On the throat plate front, you can get just a regular throat plate. You can also get one that has zero clearance, so basically it isn't cut yet, and then you can raise the saw up to have a really nice finish on that. That's what I did with this one. It's actually gotten worn out a little bit. I need to get a new one for that. And they are adjustable with some screws here and here so that they get perfectly flat with the tabletop. So if you make a lot of cuts that aren't full depth and the guard keeps getting in the way for you, or you're just not willing to use the guard, they also do give you this riving knife. Now this will match the top of the blade. So if you're only making a cut that goes partially through the board, this will still stick up through there, prevent that from closing up on you while also not getting in the way, so you can keep this on all the time. So I think it's a nice option that they give that to you as well. So I'm really happy with the saw. I think it works really well. I think SawStop could have gone and just made their fancy blade stopping mechanism and put it in a saw that's a piece of junk, and they still would have sold a pile of them, but they didn't. They went and made a really nice saw. Everything on the saw is really nicely thought out. The only two complaints I have about it are the switch engaging the bypass mode, and then also this extension table over here. This is just a melamine table. I understand that you probably don't want to have cast iron going out 5 feet or something like that. That would probably be a waste, but it works fine. It's just a little lower quality than I was expecting compared with the rest of the saw. Everything else about the saw, these tops are nice ground cast iron. The rest of it's all nice heavy duty steel that's been very nicely powder coated. Everything works really well about it, and all the crank handles, the fence, everything slides really nicely and turns really nicely. It's really a nice saw. I'm very happy to get it. I don't think you could get a higher quality saw of this traditional type. Maybe some of the European sliding table saws are a little higher quality, but they're also much more expensive. But I'm very happy that they decided to go the extra mile and make a really nice saw, in addition to having the really good safety feature built on top of that. If you do really like sliding table saws, they do make an add-on for this to allow the table to slide. It's pretty expensive and I don't really have room for it. They also make another add-on where you can replace one of these wings with a router table. That's something I'm going to be looking forward to in the future. So that's all I've got for you today. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up, and thanks for watching.